Now I'm going to move on to a more focused discussion of the Park Avenue area, starting with an overview of the considerations that led us to where we are today. Next slide, please. So the following factors have really led the project team to propose changing the trail alignment from the previously approved coastal side of the tracks to routing the trail along Park Avenue. The first is cost. So in response to the significantly increased cost estimates, the RTC completed a value engineering and value analysis study for the project in June of 2024 to find ways to reduce project cost and ensure project delivery given the limited Measure D capacity. The VA study included a strategy to route the trail along the Park Avenue right-of-way because it is expected to save significant cost. The ability to save costs is the primary factor driving the proposal to route the trail along Park Avenue. Second factor is that routing the trail along the Park Avenue right-of-way provides a long-term solution that avoids potential conflicts with future passenger rail within the rail right-of-way and ensures that the trail remain a viable and continuous active transportation route. And finally, putting the trail along Park Avenue, as Kailash mentioned, provides an opportunity for the rail trail project to address the traffic calming project goals. It also provides better connectivity and access to the surrounding neighborhood. And I'm going to go into details on all of those things in the next few slides. Next slide. So due to the length of the Park Avenue area, it's easier to break it into halves. So I'm going to start by discussing the portion from Monterey to Grove. Next slide, please. So this is a slide showing an aerial view of the rail corridor and Park Avenue and depicts the previously approved coastal alignment of the trail. The existing tracks are shown by the dashed line in red, and the dashed line in yellow shows the currently approved alignment on the coastal side of the tracks. The original design analysis in 2022 explored options here for the trail, including the coastal, inland, and Park Avenue alignments, and the coastal alignment at the time was expected to minimize impacts to the Escalona Gulch Monarch site, shown in green. Next slide, please. So this slide shows details of the currently approved coastal alignment with the trail on the coastal side of the tracks. The cross sections along the bottom of the two black and white images show the large retaining walls that are needed to support the trail due to the existing steep topography, as well as a viaduct on the bottom right screen that is needed to cross Escalona Gulch. In the image on the bottom right, the trail and rail are shown in relation to the Escalona Gulch monarch habitat, shown by the green circle, and the critical windbreak trees along Park Avenue, shown by the more oblong green shape. The perspective view in the bottom left shows another view of the large dual retaining wall system that is proposed for the coastal alignment and is needed to avoid tiebacks from a single wall system that would extend under adjacent private property. The large retaining walls and viaduct in this area contributed in part to the $27 million cost increases that I mentioned previously and the suggestion by the value analysis team to move the trail onto Park Avenue. Next slide. So the RTC developed a conceptual alignment for passenger rail in 2024 as part of their zero-emission passenger rail and trail project. This slide shows the conceptual alignment from Monterey Avenue to Grove Lane. The yellow lines demonstrate the required horizontal clearances that are required for passenger rail operations and demonstrate that passenger rail would require the entire right-of-way width for this portion of the rail corridor and overlap with the proposed coastal alignment, which is shown on the bottom edge of the rail right-of-way. Therefore, shifting the trail out of the rail corridor minimizes the risk of future trail modifications or removals that could arise if future transportation projects are pursued. Next slide, please. As Kailash mentioned in much more detail, since the original coastal alignment was developed for this area, the city has been pursuing a traffic calming project along Park Avenue. Outreach conducted by the city, as Kailash mentioned, indicated that there was a strong desire from the community for a separated bicycle and pedestrian facility. Routing the rail trail along Park Avenue addresses the community's desires to have this separated facility along Park Avenue and will contribute to the overall safer Park Avenue corridor. Next slide, please. So to reduce cost, avoid conflict with the future future transportation options in the rail corridor, and to align with the safety measures proposed in the traffic calming project, county staff, the project team, and RTC staff recommend routing the trail along the southern edge of the Park Avenue right-of-way. One of the benefits of the Park Avenue alignment is that it improves neighborhood connectivity to the trail. The red arrows show where new crosswalks and RRFBs, those are the flashing beacons that Kailash mentioned, are proposed. Those would provide safe access to the trail. These trail access points to and from the Cliffwood Heights neighborhood do not exist for the coastal alignment because it's on the coastal side of the tracks and separate from the neighborhood. Next slide, please. The trail along Park Avenue would be very similar to that originally proposed in the coastal alignment. It would be the same width, 12 feet, and it would be comprised of the same material, asphalt. I read a lot of comments from people that are concerned about safety, so I wanted to really emphasize that we are not simply proposing to put paint on the roadway. This will be a Class 1 multi-use trail adjacent to the roadway, not an on-street facility. It will be vertically separated from the roadway by a curb and horizontally separated by a buffer. The images on the screen show similar conditions to what is proposed along Park Avenue, showing the curb and the buffer separating trail users from traffic. The cross-section at the bottom of the screen is what is proposed for Park Avenue. A good local example of this, or the best one that I can think of, is East Cliff Drive, where there's a curb between the vehicular lane and the pathway, providing sort of that vertical separation I mentioned. And just note that East Cliff is different in that it does not have that horizontal buffer between the roadway and the trail. Next slide, please. So these are plans showing the western half of the Monterey to Grove portion. Along the bottom of the drawing is a cross-section or cross-sections representing different conditions of the trail. As you can see, walls are still needed to support the trail due to adjacent topography, but to a lesser degree than that for the coastal alignment. The project, as I mentioned before, would install several elements of the traffic calming project, including lane width reductions and speed feedback signs, but would add crosswalks with the RRFBs at McCormick, Washburn, and the 600 Park Avenue apartment driveway to provide safe access to the trail from the adjacent neighborhood. These new crossings were not included in the traffic calming project, but were added here to provide that additional connectivity and access to the neighborhood. And the image on the bottom right shows an example of a crosswalk with an RRFB for those who are not familiar. Next slide. Moving east, this page shows the eastern half of the Monterey to Grove portion. Again, along the bottom of the drawing are cross sections representing different conditions of the trail. Note that the cross section in the middle illustrates one of two sections along the trail in which the trail grade is lower than the roadway grade. And this is needed to maintain an ADA accessible longitudinal slope of the trail in areas where the road slopes steeply. The Park Avenue alignment moves the trail further away from the Escalona Gulch Monarch site, shown by the green circle, but requires removal of some of the eucalyptus trees along Park Avenue that function as critical windbreak for the monarch habitat, shown with the green oblong shape. To avoid impacting the monarch habitat to the maximum extent possible, the project is proposing to reconstruct the existing sidewalk, curb, and gutter along the 600 Park Avenue frontage on the north side of the road, which you can see shown by the sort of the dark line work on the north side of Park Avenue. And this would allow us to move the sidewalk approximately 4 feet inland to the edge of the city-owned right-of-way. And this allows both the road and the trail to shift inland in the area directly adjacent to the Escalona Gulch habitat and reduces the need to remove windbreak trees. It's a subtle shift, but if you look closely at the plans, you can see just west of that green shape, how the roadway center line shifts to the north slightly through that area. The potential impacts to monarch habitat that would come as a result of the Park Avenue alignment will be analyzed as part of additional environmental review for this alignment, and I'll discuss that at the end of my presentation. Next slide, please. So these images show two options for how to build the trail along Park Avenue. The views are taken from Grove Lane and looking west toward the village. The Escalona Gulch Monarch site is on the left of the image off screen. Option A, shown on top, preserves the inland bike lane to provide more flexibility for cyclists. Option B, on the bottom, maximizes use of the street right-of-way for the trail and shifts the southern edge of the trail inland. Critically, in the locations shown, it may allow for the preservation of additional windbreak trees along Park Avenue, thereby reducing potential impacts to the adjacent Escalona Gulch monarch habitat. Shifting the edge of the trail inland also reduces the height of retaining walls needed to support the trail. The reconstructed sidewalk, curb, and gutter along the 600 Park Avenue frontage is shown on the right side of the screen. In the middle of each image shows the additional crosswalk with RFB at the 600 Park Avenue driveway, again, improving that connectivity to the surrounding neighborhood. Both options include elements of the traffic calming project, including narrow travel lanes and speed feedback signs. Next slide, please. So the key difference between option A and option B is the inland bike lane. As part of this design effort, we analyzed how the neighborhood accesses the existing Park Avenue bike lanes to determine the potential impacts to bike circulation from removing the inland bike lane. For this portion of Park Avenue, there are 21 residences with direct access to the inland bike lane. Most of the neighborhood accesses Park Avenue and the bike lane from the side streets shown in red: McCormick, Washburn, Wesley, and the 600 Park Avenue driveway. This is where new crosswalks and RFBs are proposed, as I mentioned previously, giving the vast majority of neighborhood residents direct access to the trail. Therefore, there will be minimal impact from removal of the inland bike lane in this portion of the corridor, as is proposed in option B. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to move on to the eastern half of the Park Avenue area from Grove Lane to Coronado Street. Next slide, please. So this slide shows an aerial view of the rail corridor in Park Avenue, depicting the coastal alignment, shown with the dashed light yellow line, and the existing tracks, shown in red. Next slide, please. This shows details of the currently approved coastal alignment with the trail on the coastal side of the tracks. The cross sections, again, along the bottom of the plans, show the retaining walls that are needed to cut the trail into the existing embankment for much of this area. On the right, the plans show a viaduct that is needed due to the existing steep slopes above the New Brighton State Beach parking lot. And again, the retaining walls and viaduct needed as part of this infrastructure are contributing to that previously mentioned $27 million cost estimate. Next slide, please. So to avoid the costs, similarly to the other portion of the corridor, avoid costs associated with retaining walls and the viaduct, and again, to align this with the safety measures proposed in the traffic calming project, the county staff, project team, and RTC staff are recommending routing the trail along the southern edge of the Park Avenue right-of-way in this portion of the corridor. An added benefit of that is that the trail along Park Avenue is further from the eroding coastal bluffs in this area. Next slide, please. So this is a plan showing the western half of the Grove to Coronado portion. Along the bottom of the drawing is a cross-section representing the condition of the trail. You can see that no walls are needed for this portion of the Park Avenue alignment because the trail is within the footprint of the existing roadway. The project, like other areas, would install elements of the traffic calming project, including lane width reductions and speed feedback signs. Next slide. And finally, this is a plan showing the eastern half of the Grove to Coronado portion. Again, the trail is within the existing roadway footprint for much of this section, avoiding the need for walls. And then after the Coronado intersection, the trail ramps down to the grade of the existing rail line, where a new formal railroad crossing is proposed and supported by CPUC staff. This would allow trail users to connect to the remainder of segment 11 on the coastal side of the tracks as it moves through New Brighton State Beach, as well as access to a proposed new stair to New Brighton State Beach that improves beach access. Along Park Avenue, the existing three-way stop intersection at Coronado would be improved with striping that allows westbound cyclists safe access to the rail trail. You can see that striping there in green on the slide. And this would be the case under either option A or B. And pedestrians would access the trail via the crosswalk shown on the left side of that intersection. Next slide, please. So these images are showing two different options for the Park Avenue alignment, the option A and B that I mentioned previously. These views are just east of Cabrillo, looking east or towards New Brighton State Beach. Option A on top, again, preserves that inland bike lane, providing more flexibility for cyclists. And option B on the bottom maximizes use of the right-of-way for the trail. And from Grove Lane to Coronado, this allows for a wider buffer between vehicles and trail users, which you can see on the images above, shown by the tan area, while still keeping the trail within the existing roadway section. Option B likely also reduces the need for retaining walls because eliminating the inland bike lane allows that trail to shift inland. And I'd just like to point out the improved views of the coast from the raised vantage point of Park Avenue, whereas compared to the original coastal alignment, views of the ocean are obstructed by the large embankment on the coast side of the tracks. Next slide, please. Again, the key difference between option A and option B is the inland bike lane, and we wanted to understand the impacts of removing the inland bike lane in this area as well. So from Grove Lane to Coronado Street, there are 0 residences that have direct access to Park Avenue and the inland bike lane in this area. Most of the neighborhood accesses Park Avenue and the bike lane from the side streets, again, shown by those red arrows. And this is where new crosswalks and RFBs are proposed, giving the majority of residents direct access to the trail. Next slide, please. So the project team, county staff, and RTC staff are recommending the council approve option B. We acknowledge that this differs from the city staff recommendation, but we think the potential benefits to the project under option B are considerable. Option B may reduce the number of critical windbreak trees that are removed along Park Avenue. This would then reduce impacts to monarch habitat and reduce risk to the project. This is largely why option B has support from staff of the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. Option B also likely reduces the amount of retaining walls, thereby reducing costs. And finally, option B allows for a wider buffer between vehicles and trail users from Grove to Coronado, and removal of the inland bike lane has minimal impacts to bicycle circulation and access. We presented both options to the RTC's Bicycle Advisory Committee on Monday, and the Bicycle Advisory Committee voted to support option B, giving additional direction to the project team to consider installing an appropriate vertical barrier between vehicles and trail users. And this is something we plan to study and look at as part of final design.